All right, hello everyone. Hope you're doing well. Hope you're having a great week. Thanks for everything you're doing for the course. A lot of investment in time and energy. Hope you're getting a lot of value out of it, and then sort of just creating a lot of sort of sociological thought, using your sociological imagination, seeing the world and your own position within it in a different way. Um, for this week, we're going to focus on stratification, both social stratification and global stratification. As with a lot of these chapters in the class, we could spend a whole term on one of these subject areas. In fact, the further you move on, if you moved on in sociology as a discipline, you'd find you have full classes just devoting a whole term to, or multiple terms to these subject areas that are powerful. So our goal here is just to kind of shed some light on some big picture pieces about stratification applied to kind of more of a local format, national format, and then think about global stratification. So I'm just going to lay out a few ideas and then encourage you through the assignment to kind of explore and engage a little bit further in terms of this stuff. So stratification is universal. I mean, all societies are stratified in different ways. So it's very culture specific. Could be like, Western ways of stratifying versus Eastern ways of stratifying could be different. You can find patterns going on there, but I think it's fair to say that all societies are stratified to some extent, to some degree. The question is to what degrees do they vary? So we have variability in stratification, degree of difference between the top and the bottom, and the rungs in between. So we're looking at a layering when we're looking at stratification. So does that layering system work? What is the gap between the top and the bottom, and then what are the steps in between? And cultures vary quite markedly, in regards to inequality or stratification. And even in one particular nation across time. I mean, in the United States in the 1940s and 1950s, we had what's called the Great Convergence, where things actually, along race and class lines, that things were improving for more and more people, that the gap between the top and the bottom was smaller, the degree of inequality was smaller, and then it started to expand, especially in the late 1970s and 1980s, is sort of, the growing gap between the top and the bottom. And where we're at today, there's a lot of concern, I think, about that gap between the top and the bottom. So one thing is variable. It's variable across place and time. The other thing about stratification is that it has to be justified. You have to have a way of explaining it, as a society, as a social system. So if you have a gap between the top and the bottom, if that gap is like this, it's one thing, it's like in Japan, the gap between the average CEO and the average worker, it's much more of a collectivistic society, so the gap may be fairly narrow. And that comes out of a culture, an expression of culture about a greater sense of unity among more and more individuals within that community. It's more of a shared collective effort. It's not that there's no difference between power or issues of inequality within Japan, but it's much more narrow. It's a different cultural framework. In the United States, we're much larger. Our inequality, that gap between the top and the bottom, specifically the top 1%, and even smaller than that, the top 0.1%, it's significant. So we have to explain that in some way. We have to provide some justification, and that's what's called ideology. Ideology is a belief system that explains reality. It's not necessarily it's true. It's just what is the explanation we give that? Why is it that way? And in the United States, historically, our ideology, dominant ideology, has been a kind of a combination of rugged individualism and the Protestant work ethic, and those two things together. So this idea that our cultural value puts a lot of focus on, it's through your work you're demonstrating your moral worth. So you work hard, and if you're not doing things in the community that are demonstrating your hard work, you're not viewed as being a morally good person. So, and we also view that everybody has equal opportunity in this country, that, if you just work hard enough, you can get to those places. So pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, that very rugged individualistic sort of perspective. Well, that's our dominant ideology, right? That's the way we explain that. We say that there's more than enough opportunity for people to get where they need to go. It's really a matter of individual choice whether they get there or not. And what that does, I think there's always some degree of truth to that. I mean, people can make different choices and they can get themselves going in different directions. But to say it's only that minimizes an examination of the way that structure and culture shapes the world and the experience for certain groups that give them more privilege in that system, and for other groups they experience much more disadvantage in that system. So one thing I want you to address in your kind of question area for the week, the thing to respond to, is to identify what do you see as kind of structural privileges, things that are within our social system that provide a lot of opportunity for people for certain groups to get ahead. So it's like structured privilege, systems of privilege, or roadblocks, structured inequalities that are within society itself. Where do you see what kind of systems? Where do you see that going on? That it's not the same experience for everyone. That some people have a significant advantage, other groups have a disadvantage. So kind of identify that and talk about that, in 150 to 200 words, sort of talk about that particular piece. Another way of thinking about stratification too is thinking about that sort of linkage between privilege and domination. Historically, we've starting in the 1960s, 1970s, all the way to the 1980s, I think, our focus was talking about in academia and maybe even broader society, talking about areas of disadvantage, the marginalized groups, the oppressed groups, the groups that were were experiencing a lot of discrimination and inequalities. But rarely do we talk about systems of privilege, and actually these two things are linked up. I mean, systems of stratification are both a system of domination as well as a system of privilege. In one way, it's easier to talk about, actually easier, but it's one thing to talk about domination because we're talking about sort of the non-privileged group. And like, okay, how do we do a better job of making sure society's providing good services and providing adequate opportunities for that group? That's one thing. And then you start moving into privilege, it's going to get tricky, right? If you start to challenge the system of privilege and say, look, there's a lot of privilege we got to start to address and be able to take away, the privilege that certain groups have. And usually people don't want to give up privilege, right? First of all, they may not even recognize that they have that privilege. But number two is they probably are not going to willingly relinquish that privilege because there's a lot of advantage they have within that system. And people willingly probably are not going to give up advantage that they have. So that relates us to, I want to sort of tie in sort of to all that discussion, this idea of the cultural value or the belief, the ideology, the justification, kind of is wrapped up in all that sort of stuff, that rugged individualism, hard work, effort. Those who have a lot of privilege, that's probably been their experience, right? They've worked hard, they've navigated systems, they've been able to get where they need to go. And sometimes lacking empathy, understanding that not everybody has the same experience. I mean, I think, and then if we live in a very class segregated society, like most people live in a class segregated communities, racially segregated as well, not by law, just by, it's called de facto segregation, just based on housing patterns. If we're living in communities, our housing is class segregated, it's going to be race segregated, then our schools are going to be that way too, our public schools. And so we struggle with this sort of idea of really understanding what it may be like for different people with different experiences. And part of the goal, I think, of examining any stuff about stratification is being more comprehensive in understanding and more objective in understanding about these things. Okay, so now let's kind of transition a little bit into some theory stuff and then end up in global stratification. So functionalism and conflict theories, you'll read in both chapters, they provide a viewpoint or perspective on stratification. Functionalism has a sort of viewpoint that since all societies are stratified, it must have some function and importance to it. And I think to some extent you can argue that, or you can think through sort of from a way of thinking. Think, well, there's some truth to that, right? That the medical professional, the doctor, the surgeon needs to get paid more, or gets paid more than somebody, a nurse's aide, because their roles are different within that institution. The education required, the skills required, all that kind of stuff. So there's the functional importance of the job does drive wages to some degree. The problem with that perspective, the limit of that perspective, that's not the whole story. If you look at the average wage of the average CEO versus the average worker in the United States, back in the 1970s, I want to say it was like 150 to 1, 130 to 1, something like that. And then different time periods in the last decade, it's been up to 450 times to 1 of the average CEO versus the average worker. I mean, that's not because, that people are working harder or less or their skill set. There's a lot of other things that are going on that kind of explain that. So, but that functionalist viewpoint has that lens. The conflict theory viewpoint has a perspective that stratification benefits. It's a benefit for those in power. That if you are in those positions of power, you control institutions. You can shape institutions in ways to your own advantage. So stratification, you get things like, people who have a lot of economic and social power, social capital. They can exert a lot of influence on systems. And because of that, that influence, they can reinforce a system of stratification, to their own advantage kind of thing. So conflict theory is going to be very critical of certain systems and looking for, not that it wants society to be that way, but you got to critique society to actually make improvements of it and radically transform things in society. So with global stratification, it's basically taking these ideas, right, and then applying them to the sort of global network of connection between nations. Specifically, as we became, as countries became more and more engaged in trade between nations, and globalization and capitalism are going on at the same time. Like our levels of globalization today, with new technologies, the ability to facilitate movement of goods and services around the world, and sharing of data, it's amazing how we are connected in this global network and this global system, and it starts to get, I think a lot of areas of opportunities and a lot of areas to be concerned about too, because we're talking about transnational corporations now having a lot of influence not only within nation, but in a global network and a global system. So think about I think the highest traded commodity today is actually data. And you think about Amazon, I believe, is the number one procurer of data, and they make a lot of money based on just sort of sequestering data and selling data to different organizations. And this is global. It's a global network and global system. So thinking about global stratification, one thing I like to keep in mind is sort of this dependency theory idea, is that the developed world or high-income countries, their economic situation is in part influenced by middle-income and low-income countries that, in the West, in the United States, in a high-income country, we can afford our ways of life because of forced underdevelopment of different countries. Like whether that's labor or goods and services, that a lot of what we get in terms of mass consumption and our consumption culture is we can do this because we're, we're exporting labor, exporting, from different countries, and the conditions we're removed from the ways in which things are being produced, the ways that things are being, from the individual all the way through the market, all the way to the shelves in our stores. And so I think that's by design. So there's a lot of stuff that's going on. This linkage, when you're reading global stratification, I want you to be thinking about is sort of this linkage between the high, the middle, the low income countries, that there's a relationship between those three things. All right, so I think that's it for now. Just kind of want to give you an overview. I hope you enjoy these readings that are powerful. It's a core area of sociology. If you go back, to the Marxist perspective, conflict theory, of course, Marx was a political economist or a political scientist, and he sort of did this examination. He's interested in economic systems, and a lot of stratification. I was talking a lot about class. We're going to talk about gender and race stratification next few weeks. We're thinking about ways in which stratification happens, not only along class lines, but along other lines as well. All right, thanks for all you do. Hope you have a great week, and talk to you later.